What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors reaches his absolute breaking point on live television? Tonight, we're diving into the moment. Mark Wahlberg completely lost it on Jimmy Kimmel's show. And trust me, you've never seen anything like this before. The tension was so thick, you could cut it with a knife, and what started as a routine promotional interview turned into television history for all the wrong reasons. Make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story gets more intense with every passing minute. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday evening as Mark Wahlberg settled into the guest chair opposite Jimmy Kimmel. What should have been a standard promotional appearance for Mark's latest action thriller was about to become something entirely different. Jimmy had that familiar smirk plastered across his face, the one that usually signals he's about to push boundaries for the sake of entertainment. "So Mark, great to have you back on the show," Jimmy began, his voice carrying that trademark mix of false sincerity and barely contained mischief. "I've got to ask you about something that's been trending on social media. There's this viral video of you at a Boston restaurant last week, and people are saying you were pretty, let's call it animated, with the staff." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw already beginning to tighten. He knew exactly what Jimmy was referring to, a moment that had been taken completely out of context and blown up across the internet. "Jimmy, that's not what happened, at all. The situation was completely different from what people are making it out to be." But Jimmy wasn't interested in hearing the real story. He leaned forward with that predatory gleam in his eyes, the one that appeared whenever he sensed weakness or controversy. "Come on, Mark, we've all seen the footage. You're pointing your finger, raising your voice, the whole 9 yards. Are you telling me that wasn't you having a classic Boston meltdown?" The audience chuckled, but Mark's expression darkened considerably. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, that familiar surge of anger that he'd worked so hard to control over the years. "Listen, Jimmy, I was defending my family. Some guy was taking pictures of my kids without permission, being inappropriate, and when I asked him to stop, he got aggressive. I did what any father would do." Jimmy waved his hand dismissively, as if Mark's explanation was nothing more than damage control, right? "Right. But let's be honest here. You've got quite the reputation for these kinds of outbursts, don't you? I mean, we could do a whole montage of Mark Wahlberg losing his temper over the years." The studio audience was eating. It ubbed, their laughter growing louder with each jab. Mark could feel his professional composure beginning to crack. He'd come here to promote his movie, to do his job. And instead, he was being ambushed on national television by someone he'd considered a friend. "You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight as a courtesy to talk about my work, to give your viewers some entertainment. But if you want to sit here and make jokes about me protecting my children, then maybe we're done here." Mark's voice was steady, but anyone who knew him could hear the warning signs. Jimmy's grin only widened. He was getting exactly the reaction he wanted, and the cameras were capturing every second of it. "Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive. This is what we do here. We have fun, we joke around. You can take it, right? Big tough guy like you." That last comment hit Mark like a physical blow. The condescending tone, the mocking smile, the way Jimmy was treating him like some kind of caricature instead of a human being. Mark had spent decades building his reputation, working to overcome his past mistakes, and here was someone supposedly on his side tearing him down for cheap laughs. "Sensitive," Mark repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register. "You think this is about being sensitive? You're sitting there making light of a situation where someone was harassing my children, turning it into a punchline for your monologue, and you want to call me sensitive." The temperature in the studio seemed to shift. Even some of the audience members were beginning to look uncomfortable as they sensed the genuine anger radiating from the guest chair. But Jimmy, either oblivious to the warning signs or simply not caring, pressed forward. "Look, I get it. You're protective of your family. That's admirable. But you've got to admit, the optics weren't great. I mean, there you are, Mark Wahlberg, movie star, millionaire, getting into it with some random guy at a restaurant. It's kind of funny when you think about it." Mark's hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to walk away, to maintain his professionalism. But Jimmy's relentless mockery was wearing down his defenses. "Funny? You think it's funny that I stood up to someone who was violating my family's privacy? You think it's funny that I refused to let some stranger make my kids uncomfortable? Jimmy shrugged, that infuriating smirk never leaving his face. I think it's funny that you couldn't handle the situation without making a scene. I mean, you could have just asked security to handle it, or moved to a different table, or done any number of things that wouldn't have ended up on YouTube. The words hit Mark like a slap across the face. Jimmy's casual dismissal of his parental instincts, his complete lack of understanding or empathy, was pushing Mark past every boundary he'd set for himself. The actor leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked on Jimmy's with an intensity that made several crew members shift nervously behind the cameras. Handle it, handle it. Mark's voice was rising now, each word dripping with barely controlled fury. Let me tell you something, Jimmy. When someone is making your 7-year-old daughter uncomfortable, when they're taking pictures of her while she's trying to eat her dinner, you don't call security. You don't move tables. You handle it yourself. Immediately, Jimmy, still riding high on what he perceived as great television, couldn't resist pushing further. But Mark, come on, you're a public figure. This comes with the territory. Your kids are going to deal with this their whole lives. Maybe instead of flying off the handle, you could teach them how to handle it with a little more grace. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even Jimmy's most loyal audience members could sense they were witnessing something that had crossed a line. Mark's face had gone completely rigid, his breathing shallow and controlled in a way that suggested he was fighting every instinct in his body. Grace, Mark repeated, his voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow more threatening than if he'd been shouting. You want to talk to me about grace? You, who makes a living mocking people on national television, want to lecture me about how to raise my children? Jimmy's confidence was finally beginning to waver, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. Hey, that's not fair. I make jokes, sure, but I don't go around intimidating people in restaurants. There's a difference between comedy and aggression. Mark, that was the moment something inside Mark Wahlberg snapped. He stood up abruptly from his chair, his full frame towering over the desk that separated him from his host. The sudden movement caused Jimmy to instinctively lean back, his smug expression finally cracking. Aggression? Mark's voice was now carrying the full weight of his Boston upbringing, every word loaded with decades of street wisdom and hard-earned respect. You want to see aggression. Jimmy, you've been sitting there for the last 10 minutes on your show in front of your audience, systematically trying to humiliate me. You've mocked my parenting, dismissed my concerns about my children's safety, and now you're trying to paint me as some kind of unstable hothead, and you call that comedy. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of what was quickly becoming the most uncomfortable moment in late-night television history. Jimmy's producers were frantically gesturing from behind the cameras, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the confrontation play out. Mark, I think you're overreacting. Here, Jimmy said, trying to regain control of the situation. This is just how the show works. We joke around, we have fun, we don't take everything so seriously. Mark leaned forward, placing both hands on Jimmy's desk, his face now inches from the host's, overreacting. Jimmy, let me explain something. To you, I've been in this business for over 20 years. I've sat in hundreds of interviews, dealt with thousands of reporters, and I understand how this game works. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism, it isn't entertainment, it's character assassination. Jimmy tried to maintain his composure, but the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed his growing anxiety. Look, Mark, I didn't mean to upset you. Maybe we should just move on. Talk about your movie. Keep things light. Keep things light. Mark's laugh was cold and humorless. You don't get to decide when we keep things light, Jimmy. You opened this door when you decided to ambush me with that video. You kept it open when you mocked my reaction to someone threatening my family. And now that you've pushed me to this point, you want to just move on. The audience was completely silent now, the usual energy of a late-night talk show replaced by the kind of tension usually reserved for courtroom dramas. Jimmy's bandleader was looking around nervously, unsure whether to jump in with music or let the confrontation continue. I wasn't trying to ambush you, Jimmy protested weakly. It was just a question about something that's already public knowledge. People are talking about it online, so I thought we should address it. Mark straightened up, his hands still planted firmly on the desk. Address it. Jimmy, you didn't want to address anything. You wanted to exploit it. You saw an opportunity to get some viral clips, maybe boost your ratings, and you decided my reputation was acceptable collateral damage. Jimmy's voice was getting higher, more defensive. That's not true, Mark. I've always been fair to you. You've been on this show multiple times. We've always had good interviews. Fair. Mark's eyes were blazing now. Jimmy, in the last 15 minutes, you've called me sensitive, suggested I can't control my temper, implied I'm a bad father, and basically turned my children's safety into a punchline. If that's your idea of fair, then we have very different definitions of the word. The host was now visibly sweating, his usual quick wit completely abandoning him in the face of Mark's relentless verbal assault. I never said you were a bad father. I would never say that. You didn't have to say it directly, Mark shot back. You said it with every smirk, every dismissive comment, every time you turned a serious situation into a joke. You've been saying it since the moment I sat down in this chair. Jimmy looked desperately toward his producers, but they were frozen, unsure how to handle a situation that had spiraled so far beyond their control. Mark, I think we're both getting a little heated. Here, maybe we should take a breath, reset, and start over. Mark's response was immediate and cutting. Reset. Jimmy, you don't get to reset when you've spent the better part of 20 minutes systematically trying to destroy someone's character on national television. You don't get to just wave your hand and pretend this conversation never happened. The silence that followed was deafening. Jimmy's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his career, the professional comedian had been rendered completely speechless. You know what the real problem is here, Jimmy? Mark continued, his voice now steady and controlled, which somehow made it even more intimidating. You've gotten so comfortable hiding behind your desk, behind your writers, behind your audience's laughter, that you've forgotten you're dealing with real people. You've forgotten that the person sitting across from you has feelings, has a family, has a reputation that matters to them. Jimmy finally found his voice, though it was shaky and uncertain. I do care about people, Mark. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. But you are hurting people, Mark responded immediately. Every time you decide that someone's personal struggles are fair game for your monologue, every time you turn someone's worst moment into entertainment, you're hurting people. And the worst part is, you don't even seem to realize you're doing it. The confrontation was reaching a crescendo, and everyone in the studio could feel it. The cameras continued to roll, what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history. Jimmy wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his usual confidence completely shattered. The man who had built his career on quick comebacks and sharp wit was now struggling to form coherent sentences. Mark, I honestly didn't think you'd take it so personally. It's just how late-night television works. We make jokes about current events, about things happening in the news. Mark's expression didn't soften even slightly. If anything, Jimmy's continued attempts to justify his behavior were only fueling the fire. Just how it works. Jimmy, listen. To yourself, you're hiding behind the format of your show like it gives you permission to be cruel. You think because you're sitting behind that desk, because there's an audience laughing, that makes it okay to tear people down. The host shifted uncomfortably in his chair, looking smaller somehow than he had at the beginning of the show. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to entertain people. That's my job. Your job. Mark's voice rose again, his Boston accent becoming more pronounced as his anger intensified. Jimmy, my job is to entertain people too. I make movies. I tell stories. I try to give audiences something worthwhile. But I don't do it by humiliating other people. I don't build my career on other people's pain. Jimmy looked around the studio desperately, as if hoping someone would throw him a lifeline. His bandleader was staring at his shoes. His producers were whispering frantically among themselves, and his audience sat in stunned silence. Look, Mark, if I crossed a line, I apologize. I really do. I never meant for things to get this heated, but Mark wasn't buying the sudden change in tone. If you crossed a line, Jimmy, you didn't just cross a line, you obliterated it. And now that you're getting called out, now that someone is finally standing up to your bullying, you want to play the victim. The word bullying hit Jimmy like a physical blow. His face went pale, and for a moment, it looked like he might actually be sick. I'm not a bully, Mark. I've never been a bully. Mark leaned back slightly, but his posture remained aggressive, intimidating. Really? Then what do you call what you've been doing for the last 20 minutes? You've used your platform, your audience, your position of power to try to embarrass me. You've taken a situation where I was protecting my children and turned it into a source of mockery. If that's not bullying, then what is?" Jimmy's voice was now barely audible. "People are talking about a lot of things, Jimmy," Mark replied sharply. "People talk about celebrity divorces, about who's gained weight, about who's struggling with addiction. Does that mean you have the right to exploit all of it for your show? Does that mean other people's pain is just content for you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently, realizing that anything he said would only make things worse. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Mark continued his verbal assault. "You know what really bothers me about this whole thing, Jimmy? It's not just that you attacked me, it's that you did it with such casual cruelty. You were enjoying it. You were getting off on making me uncomfortable, on trying to make me look bad in front of your audience." Jimmy shook his head weakly. "That's not true, Mark. I wasn't enjoying it, weren't you?" Mark's eyes narrowed, because from where I'm sitting, it looked like you were having the time of your life. Every joke, every smirk, every dismissive comment, you were loving every second of it, right up until the moment I started fighting back. The host looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. His hands were trembling slightly, and his voice cracked when he spoke. Mark studied Jimmy's face for a long moment, searching for any sign of genuine remorse. What he saw instead was a man who was sorry he'd been caught, sorry the situation had spiraled out of control, but not necessarily sorry for his actions. "Your intention doesn't matter, Jimmy. The impact matters. And the impact of what you did tonight was to try to humiliate me on national television." Jimmy tried one more time to regain some semblance of control. "Maybe we could start this segment over. We could edit this part out and begin fresh with talking about your movie." The suggestion seemed to ignite something even more dangerous in Mark's eyes. "Edited out. Jimmy, you want to pretend this never happened? You want to sweep your behavior under the rug and act like everything's fine?" "I just think maybe we both said things we didn't mean," Jimmy offered lamely. Mark's laugh was harsh and bitter. "I meant every single word I said. Jimmy, every single word. And if you had any integrity at all, you'd let this air exactly as it happened. You'd let your audience see what happens when you push someone too far." Jimmy looked toward his producers. Again, panic clear in his eyes. "Mark, please, let's just try to salvage this. We can have a good conversation about your work, about your upcoming projects. Salvage this." Mark's voice was incredulous. "Jimmy, there's nothing to salvage here. You've shown your true colors tonight. You've shown that you're willing to attack a guest's character, mock their parenting, and exploit their personal struggles, all for the sake of getting a few laughs." The host was now openly pleading. "I really didn't mean it that way. I swear I didn't. I've always respected you as an actor." As a person, Mark stood up again, this time moving around the desk toward Jimmy's chair. The host instinctively rolled backward, putting distance between himself and his increasingly agitated guest. "Respected me, Jimmy. If this is how you treat people you respect, I'd hate to see how you treat people you don't like." The studio was completely silent except for the hum of the cameras and the soft whisper of the air conditioning. Even the crew members had stopped moving, afraid that any sound might escalate the situation further. "You know what's really sad about this whole thing?" Mark continued, now standing directly beside Jimmy's desk. "I actually liked you. I thought you were one of the good guys in this business. I thought you understood the difference between comedy and cruelty. But tonight, you've shown me that you're just another talk show host who's willing to sacrifice other people's dignity for ratings." Jimmy's voice was barely a whisper now. "Mark, please, I really am sorry. I know I messed up." Mark looked down at the cowering host, his expression a mixture of disgust and disappointment. "You're sorry you got caught, Jimmy. You're sorry this didn't go the way you planned. But you're not sorry for what you did, and that's the difference between a real apology and damage control." The confrontation had reached its peak, and Mark seemed to realize that nothing more could be accomplished. He straightened his jacket and looked directly into the main camera. "You know what, folks? This is exactly why I usually avoid talk shows. This is exactly why most actors would rather do their own social media than sit across from people who think our personal lives are fair game for their entertainment." Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Mark, please don't leave like this. We can work this out." Mark turned back to face the host one final time. "Work it out." "Jimmy, the only way to work this out would be for you to develop some basic human decency, and I don't think that's going to happen in the next 5 minutes." He looked back at the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, this has been an education in how not to conduct an interview. Jimmy Kimmel, everyone." The sarcasm in those final words was so thick it was almost tangible. Mark walked off the set without another word, leaving Jimmy sitting alone at his desk, visibly shaken and completely at a loss for how to proceed. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds before finally cutting to commercial, but the damage was done. Jimmy sat in stunned silence, his usual quick wit completely abandoned. The audience didn't know whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in uncomfortable silence. The host looked around the studio like a lost child, searching for someone to tell him what to do next. That's the story of how Mark Wahlberg completely lost it on Jimmy Kimmel's show. And honestly, after seeing how Jimmy handled that whole situation, can you really blame him? Make sure you subscribe for more incredible stories like this one, and let me know in the comments, do you think Mark was justified in his reaction, or did he go too far?